In December of 1878, Joseph Stalin was born in the country of Georgia. He had two brothers who had died young before him due to disease, so his mother was very protective of him. His father was an alcoholic and shoemaker. Stalin's mother later left him. During his childhood, Stalin suffers from smallpox and abnormal arm growths, resulting in permanent scars on his face and nullified use of his left arm. It is rumored that his arm's withering condition may have been caused by a blood infection in a sleighing or wrestling accident, and his smallpox case has been confirmed. At about age 8, Stalin's mother, through clever scheming, convinces a priest to let them live in his home and teach Stalin with the other kids in his practices. Stalin spends a good portion of his childhood learning to become a priest in the seminary, until winter of 1898, when his repeated infractions eventually lead to his repeated punishments and confinement. He claims to have then been kicked out for display of Marxist propaganda, but before his rise to power, he has been heard saying that he was kicked out for not being able to pay fines and a loss of financial support. Stalin left his church and joined a political group known as the Bolsheviks, who had split from Russia's Social Democrat Party and were now under the rule of Vladimir Lenin. It was here that he came to find his place in politics, and how Stalin became who he was. In 1906, Stalin marries Ekaterina Savanidze, nicknamed Kato. Kato gives birth to Stalin's son in 1907, Yakov Zugashvili, and then dies to typhus on December of that year. Stalin later would kill a good majority of her family during his Great Terror, but for now, he stated that, other than his mother, she may have been the only person he really loved. When she died, he said that with her died any feeling in him. This is one of the few times in Stalin's life where he mourned a death. Stalin spent part of his life as only a member of his party, at some point seeing some action as a newspaper editor for Pravda, the official party newspaper. That is, until March 15th, 1917, when the Russian Revolution began. This is where Stalin really came closer to power, as the government, by the end, had to be redone, and Stalin seemed fit as a higher role member. In 1914, the continent of Europe goes to war. Russia, under Tsar Nicholas II, was ill-prepared for the conflict. Russia's performance in World War I, and the effect it had in the cities of Russia, would set the stage for Lenin and his communist revolutionaries, including Stalin, to take over Russia. The Russian Civil War. During the Russian Civil War, Stalin was assigned as the director for food affairs in South Russia. He took his position in the city of Tsaritsyn, later known as Stalingrad, and immediately began taking control of the region. A secret police, known as the Cheka, began eliminating Stalin's political foes, and Stalin stole multiple shipments of supplies from his own side, the Reds. One notable incident involved Stalin loading his fellow military officials for the Reds onto a barge and then sinking this barge and killing any potential political obstacles. The people's fear of Stalin's Cheka never ceased. Rumors began that the Cheka even crucified, impaled, or descalped prisoners. Although he illegally manipulated his own people, Stalin did succeed in terrifying the citizens of the city and was able to force them into giving up thousands of tons of grain. These portions of food were sent north to the heart of the Reds' command, and Stalin did manage to complete his task. The event in the Russian Civil War is a foreshadowing of who Stalin would later become, as the actions performed here display Stalin's ruthless use of secret police and his lack of sympathy for civilians, political members, or anyone Stalin deemed an enemy. Ultimately, the Reds win the Civil War, and Lenin takes power over Russia. Lenin's rule is short-lived, however, because on January 21st, 1924, he dies while recovering from a series of strokes that began in 1923, which left him unable to attend party meetings and political events. A new leader was now needed for Russia. The two obvious candidates for leader were Stalin and Trotsky, since both had been secondary figures to Lenin in the war. Stalin, who was general secretary of party at the time, had the advantage. This was until the supposed letter by Lenin, before he had died, asked that the comrades think of a way to transfer Stalin from his post and name a different person, who in all other respects differs from Stalin. Though the letter was said to be written by Lenin, It is rumored that the real writer may have been Lenin's wife, who disapproved of Stalin. Although this letter would make Stalin's rise to power more difficult, Stalin still found a way to influence his party opinion. Stalin argued that he wanted to lead Russia the way Lenin had, and he agreed with Lenin's new economic policy. In the end, Stalin triumphed and assumed leadership, one of his two major triumphs. Though this triumph was celebrated by the public, it would later lead to years of suffering for the Russian people. In 1929, Stalin ended the new economic policy in regards to the Ukraine. Up until that time, Ukrainian peasants had been allowed to trade and sell with whomever they chose. But then, Stalin implemented his policy of agricultural collectivization. This meant that instead of a farm being owned by one person who benefited from its growth, the communist state would collect and supply the output of all farms equally. This would combine all farms to become one giant farm, where all civilians would work and be fed from. To begin this policy, Stalin singled out a class of people in Ukrainian villages as kulaks. A kulak was often a village leader and wealthier than the average Ukrainian villager. In August of 1929, the Ukrainian Council of People's Commissars issued a decree defining what a kulak farm was: a farm that regularly hired labor, a farm that contained a mill, a tannery, brick factory, or other small industrial plant, a farm that rented buildings or agricultural implements on a regular basis, any farm whose owners or managers involved themselves in trade, usury, or any other activity that produced unearned income was certainly run by kulaks too. This policy against the kulaks led to the classes fighting amongst themselves. Pasha Angelina was one of the first female tractor drivers in the USSR. In her memoir, she wrote, "We went after the kulaks, who were strong and ruthless in their hatred of everything new. Our family, and many families like ours, had been working for the kulaks for many generations. We realized that it was impossible to live on the same earth as those bloodsuckers. The kulaks stood between us and the good life, and no amount of persuasion, constraint, or ordinary taxation was sufficient enough to move them out of the way." Many of the accused kulaks were sent to the gulag. As collectivization failed to produce the promised results, the word kulak began to broaden in its use. It could now refer to those who didn't like the collectivization or those accused of sabotage. Quotas for secret police in Moscow began, requiring them to find a certain amount of kulak families. This led to the displacement of 50,000 families in the Ukraine. The promise of a better life to the people of Ukraine quickly turned tragic for the Ukrainian people. Soviets came in and took the crops from the Ukrainian people, leaving them with nothing to eat. As people began to starve, they responded by hiding food or stealing it, both of which were punishable by death. The people were forced to eat grass, tree bark, dogs, and in some cases, even corpses. Ultimately, 5 million people would perish between 1931 and 1933. On December 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov, party boss of Leningrad, was assassinated. Leonid Nikolaev was a party member who was losing prestige, and there are rumors that Kirov may have had affairs with his wife. Kirov's murder by Nikolaev would have great implications for members of the Communist Party, including those who had been with Stalin as the Communists came to power. Two of the most famous and high-ranking Communist Party members that were charged were Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev. Initially, Kamenev and Zinoviev's lives were spared. However, after a trial, Nikolaev was executed. His wife, sister-in-law, and brother-in-law were also executed. Over the next month, 663 people who worked for Zinoviev were exiled to Siberia. Later in 1935, Zinoviev and Kamenev would be tried, and in 1936, they would be executed for Trotskyism. Still, for the time before that, they were spared. Another former high-priority leader was Nikolai Bukharin, who met the same fate on March 15, 1938. These show trials and executions did not only include Communist Party members, but also military officials. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was leader of the Russian army, was also tried and executed, along with 7 other high-ranking Red Army officers. On June 11, 1937, for complicity in a Trotskyite anti-military organization, in a one-day trial, all 8 men were sentenced to death. Stalin's vengeance would even cross Russian borders, because in Mexico, on August 20th, 1940, Stalin's hitman, Ramon Mercader, would put an ice pick through Trotsky's skull. Stalin's terror would seep into the Russian society, where millions of other people were also either executed or sent to the Gulag and worked to death. In August 1939, Stalin and Hitler entered into a non-aggression pact. 1 month later, in September 1939 still, Germany and the USSR would invade Poland, dividing the country in half in less than a month. No major conflicts happened in World War II for the Soviets until on June 22, 1941, Hitler, being eager for progress, gave direct orders to invade the USSR. In Operation Barbarossa, 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft moved forward into the USSR in the largest invasion in history. The Soviets were caught completely off guard. The Nazis used fatal encirclement tactics to push the Soviets back almost to Moscow. But winter was approaching quickly, and it got extremely cold. Germany had been trying to force the Soviets to surrender before winter, but the Soviets kept fighting. Stalin gave a direct order for not one step back, and used the other soldiers to fire on any Russian who tried to retreat. Stalin ordered troops to be sent from the Siberian front. These soldiers were trained and equipped to fight in the extreme cold. The German army was no match, but they were forced to struggle against the brute Soviet force on Hitler's orders, until he finally gave in and ordered his troops to dig in for the winter. Spring 1942. Hitler changes his strategy. His plan was to cut off the Soviet army at the Caucasus, an area rich with oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take the oil. They cut through the Soviets like paper. But Hitler made a fatal decision and rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early and left the 6th Army to take the key city of Stalingrad alone. The Soviets defended the city fiercely. Back when the Germans had first invaded, the Soviets had moved their factories east. Those factories were working round the clock to get the Soviet army ready, and it finally was. Stalin had his new and improved army march down to Stalingrad, and in a tactic similar to the Germans, encircled and forced the 6th Army to surrender. After the Soviets' victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army and Germans would meet in the largest tank battle in history at the Battle of Kursk. 3,600 Soviet tanks faced 2,700 German tanks. 2,400 Soviet planes took the sky to the German 2,000 planes. 1.3 million Soviets lined up against 900,000 German soldiers. The German army would bend the Red Army, but would not break it. Eventually, the Red Army would turn back the Germans. The Soviet victory at Kursk would begin the Red Army's long and deadly march to Berlin. The Soviets kept pushing through, eventually taking Warsaw in Poland and making a run for Berlin. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery of the 1st Belarusian began shelling Berlin and did not stop. Stalin then directed his troops to encircle Berlin in a massive operation. This is where Stalin truly began triumph. Both the Germans and the Soviets fought long and hard, gaining only inches of land at a time. 45,000 German troops were defending Berlin until the very last, but with the weight of an entire war on Nazi Germany's shoulders, they collapsed. The Berlin forces surrendered. Soviet forces sustained 81,116 dead for the entire operation, but that is small compared to the German losses at 458,080 killed and 479,298 captured. But after this astounding victory against the Germans, the Red Army victory came at a high price in blood. Over 20 million Russians would perish during World War II. At the end of the war, Stalin would not only rule over Russia, but most of Eastern Europe as well. Russia would be a co-superpower, sharing this title with the United States. This will be Stalin's final triumph. 8 years later, Stalin dies from heart failure. Afterwards, the new leaders of Russia go through a de-Stalinization period, where they remove every trace of Stalin and what he did to Russia. The fact that Stalin caused such a massive impact in history makes him one of the most important figures of all time. Although he may not have been the best of figures, he still changed the way the world is, even today. Some say Stalin may have been crueler than Hitler. This may be true. Though Hitler, a very evil man himself, killed millions of people of Jewish descent or other ethnic groups, Stalin killed a much larger number of people, each with their own families. Although Stalin is the cause behind many great tragedies, he himself triumphed greatly throughout his life. Stalin grew from a very poor mother and a divorced alcoholic dad to the leader of Russia and one of the most powerful people, if not the most powerful person in the world. Stalin's control through the KGB and simply fear itself inspires years of teaching in all countries in order to prevent any disaster like this ever occurring again. Yet in his life, Stalin received praise and ultimate power, proving that he is a man of both triumph and tragedy.